to another edition of Walk Through the Ages. Today's panel discussion, we'll be covering chapters 13, 14, and 15. It was a pretty good week this week, but before we get into it, I guess we'll go ahead and start with a prayer. Kelly, would you like to pray?
I had a feeling when you were staring at me that was coming. Absolutely. Heavenly Father, we just are grateful that we can come together and talk about you and just get to glean some new things that we've learned this week and hopefully get a better and clearer picture of your beautiful character. And we just ask for the Holy Spirit to be with us in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen.
So chapter 13, I guess we'll start there, obviously, is titled The Test of Faith. Speaking of Abraham's test with Isaac, and this is just an awesome story. I guess if you guys feel anything that was kind of jumped out at you this week, just feel free to share.
Sure. I mean, it's the whole basis of this is talking about his experience with Isaac. I mean, that is really what the whole foundation is going to be. But I found it interesting that we didn't jump right into that story, even though it's the title. We actually are going to cover Ishmael.
We do.
Yes,
You're right.
Ishmael.
Yeah.
And even then, he kind of repaints the author here. She kind of repaints the landscape a little bit. You know, it's kind of talking about how polygamy had become kind of widespread throughout this region, and it was not God's original intent at all. It was contrary to what he had instructed and contrary to his law.
And it even affects Abraham.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah. The effects on Abraham with Hagar, and then in comes Ishmael into the storyline.
Right.
Yeah, and how it almost tore his entire family, his entire group apart.
Right.
You know, the jealousy and the bitterness and the anger and
Oh,
all
yeah.
that stuff.
Yeah.
I mean, here you have this, God has given him a promise that I'm going to give you a son. And he is still holding on to that promise, but there's a delay. Mm-hmm. And so sometimes God allows delays, and it talked about that, to test his faith in the power of God. So sometimes we think God isn't answering me right away. You know, what's happening? You're questioning God per se. But Abraham wasn't questioning. There happened to be a delay. But Sarah, in Genesis 16, verse 2, it talked about that Sarah said, "The Lord hath restrained me bearing." I thought that was interesting that she would say that. So God had given a promise, but now she's saying he's keeping me from getting that promise.
Mm-hmm. I need to help it along.
Right. And that's what we're going to see, right?
Yeah.
That all worked out real well, too.
Yes.
I mean, he could always use our helping hand, right?
No, that's right.
That's right.
If only he knew what we did. It'd be
Disaster.
a lot easier for him.
Absolutely not. It said, and it gives us a little shadow of her inner thoughts where it talked about that it said she thought it was impossible. Mm-hmm. She was thinking it's impossible for this to happen.
Well, it was.
I mean, it technically was.
At her age, it was impossible.
Yeah, physiologically, yeah.
But it's like we forget that God is not bound to our natural laws.
That's
Exactly.
Right. That's right.
And here she has a plan, and the plan was
Hagar.
take my handmaid. And here we also have an interesting thing too, because she wasn't of the people of God. She is actually an Egyptian.
Yeah.
Too. So it wasn't like, take my handmaid who also serves our God, take my handmaid who serves her God. A heathen, one that serves her Egyptian gods.
Yeah.
Yeah, and then it goes into the distress of like Mark was saying, just the mess it created.
Don't you love
So
it?
catty.
Don't you love too? She's the one that suggested it, and then when it goes bad, she's like, I can't believe you did this.
Yeah.
It's all your fault.
Yeah.
So I love that about that.
Catty women going at it.
Yeah.
And Hagar just pouring it on, ridiculing her.
Yeah.
Right.
But it's just, I will say this. This is very common for humanity. We are the hot mess express.
We are.
We have,
In the kindest words possible,
in
yes.
the kindest ways I can put it, we have a tendency of really royally messing things up.
Yeah.
And in spite of that, the beautiful thing is God can still manage to
Fix it.
fix our messes.
Yes.
Now, don't get me wrong. I'm not saying he's guaranteed to always fix our messes. Let's go make a mess out of
Well, there's
everything.
consequences of our messes.
Let's be clear here. I'm not saying be reckless because God will fix it and clean it up. That's not my point. But
Right.
in spite of certain situations, He is still merciful enough to kind of help us out with our messes. But you're right. There is consequences.
There is
Cause and
consequences.
effect. Yeah.
And also, I don't know if you guys caught the fact of his age when now Hagar is pregnant, but he was 86 when Ishmael was born. So just so we can also know the context between the two ages of Ishmael and Isaac. And so he was 100 when Isaac was born. And so there's a good 14 years in between, give or take because of birthdays,
Yeah.
Months. Yeah.
But yeah, 86 years old.
I mean, just when you want to be chasing around little kids, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, even worse when he was 100.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And we'll find out later that was not, he wasn't finished having children too, which is
Yeah.
really incredible.
I think Abraham can still throw the old pigskin around.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So,
What else did you guys see? Because there's so much just in the first couple pages that you go, wow.
Yeah. Well, Hagar, when she ran away, into the wilderness, and the angel had to go get her,
yeah.
and he had to put her back in her place.
He did.
He did.
Your mistress, you need to go back, right?
To be under her.
To be under her, and that must have been a hard pill to swallow. Have to grit your teeth and go back,
Yeah.
because you've messed up that relationship. You
Right.
burned that bridge.
Yeah.
But now you got to go
Go
rebuild
back.
it. And, yeah.
And it goes to show how God was actually trying to reach Hagar too.
Yeah.
Because she ends up talking about that she named that place. She's like, the God who sees and hears me. That he sees me and he hears me. This is incredible. He was trying to reach Hagar in this whole story as well.
Yeah. Hagar, I don't know.
She even
who knows?
received a promise.
She
Yeah.
did.
Yeah, she had lived with Abraham long enough to know who God was, and he was real.
Right. It was a decade that they had, before this incident with Hagar, he had been in Canaan or the land of promise for 10 years. So there was a good decade that she had been exposed, that she had opportunity.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
And back to my point, how they made a mess here. Ishmael wasn't even part of the original plan, but he comes into the scene. And in spite of that, it said God did give him a promise of blessings as well. And when God didn't have to do that, but he did. And I think that's just really merciful of God to have done that,
yeah,
to kind of give Ishmael's line
for sure.
as well.
For sure.
Yeah. And Abraham never gave up on Ishmael.
No.
He was the firstborn son,
Yeah.
right?
It shows how he was heartbroken when they did have to leave the household.
That
Could
had
you
to be
imagine?
hard.
Yeah.
I mean,
Like you said, he's still blood of his blood, bone of his bone, flesh
Yeah.
of his flesh.
Yeah.
That must have been hard. Absolutely.
Oh,
Well, it's
yeah.
like any divorce,
Yeah.
where kids and wives or whatever have to leave
yes.
or whatever. It's-
And I don't think he ever saw him again, did he?
I think it says, I don't know if you saw, I know they came together to bury.
to bury him.
Right, but
Yeah.
but like Shad's saying, I don't think they ever
Had
were
a
together. Like,
relationship.
yeah,
Not to get too far ahead, but we did see, the beautiful thing is, it later says, Ishmael eventually did come back to the God of Abraham. And I thought that was...
did you guys read that?
Yeah.
Because for me, I didn't. Oh, I didn't mean to hit my mic. But for me, I didn't know that until I
neither.
read that.
Me neither.
Because it was just an assumption that I made when you read through the word that the only thing you have left of Ishmael is that he came to bury his father,
Yeah.
and that's it.
Right.
And we only get a picture of his descendants, which is horrifying. But you don't really get his ending. So I really appreciate that, and it goes to show that the upbringing you have has an effect on you.
That's right, because he had 14, more than...
Because when he came later in life, he realized the ruin of being apart from God, and he realized that his father, the ways of his father were right, and he decided to go back.
That's right.
Yeah. That's the way a lot of people are, They,
Yes.
they get out and get on their own, and they forget all about God
Yeah.
and don't want to have anything to do with him.
Yeah.
But then later in life, they're like, well, it wasn't so bad.
I mean, we have a perfect example of Solomon.
Yeah.
Right?
Right.
Yeah.
It's kind of like the parable of the son coming back.
The prodigal.
Prodigal son.
Sure, absolutely.
Yeah.
And it didn't, really go into it, and I'll just briefly mention the fact that Mike was talking about how God had blessed Ishmael, and he did. He also was given 12 princes, just like, not Jacob, just like Isaac will eventually have 12 tribes. And so it was interesting how that played out.
Yeah. It is. It's pretty interesting. Then, of course, through the years, obviously, Abraham transfers all that knowledge of God to Isaac.
Yeah.
And, that character, he kind of starts building that character in Isaac.
Absolutely.
That's very important. Or otherwise, the things that we get to in the next couple chapters, those things don't happen, right?
Yes.
If Abraham doesn't share the knowledge of God to Isaac and raise him as to be fearful and respectful of God, then he doesn't have a character to
Go through this.
go through that test and be
Yeah.
willful to lay down as that sacrifice.
Right. And I'll ask you guys, every time I hear the Bible story of Isaac at this moment, when we get to Mount Moriah, you always envision him like 8 years old, because all the animated Bible
Yeah.
stories have him as a little kid. But it's clearly, he had him at 100 years old. He had this experience of this great test at 120,
Yes.
meaning that Isaac was 20 years old.
He was at his peak.
Yeah,
physically.
exactly. He said the son of promise had grown up to manhood at this time. And I kind of thought it was interesting too that even the picture kind of shows this like child like on the altar.
Little kid. Yeah.
And something else I was talking to Mike about this week, it was like when we always talk about the sacrifice, we always show our arm like how? Like when he went to go make the sacrifice, what do we do with our arm?
You visually
You visually do it like this, right? Because that's what the picture's doing. But that's not correct.
No, yeah,
Exactly.
it's this
Had to
way.
slit the throat.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It means, and when you read in the Bible, it said he stretched forth. We have it showing like he raised it up. He didn't say he raised it up, he stretched it forth because he knew the sacrifice had to go across the throat.
Yeah.
So I always thought that was interesting as well, that even the animation shows it raised up.
Yeah. One thing that really, let me rewind a little bit if I may. One thing that really struck a chord with me and just jumped out at me is we never give it much thought, but it was a 3-day journey
Yeah.
from where they were camped to the mountain that God was going to tell them to make the sacrifice on. And that's 3 days that Abraham had to wrestle with.
Had to fester.
Oh.
Yeah, and so and he kept it all internal, right? He didn't even tell Sarah about it.
Yeah, it brings out that he wanted to tell somebody because he had this
Right.
burden,
Yeah.
but he just couldn't. He couldn't tell Isaac.
Right, he can't tell Isaac.
Oh, by the way, son, we're going to go.
Can I share something with you?
Come in here and let me talk to you.
That's right.
But the point is, during those 3 days is how excruciating.
Oh, yeah.
Because it says here, we read that Satan was whispering in his ear, trying to cast doubt into this promise. And this to me is a very interesting, and I want to really focus on this, it's a really interesting, I don't know what you call it, conundrum, dilemma, circumstance, because here you have Abraham, who has been given the promise through Isaac. God said, the promise of the to multiply you as nations will come through Isaac.
Right.
But now I'm going to ask you for his life. How do you, how does that puzzle fit?
Oh,
How does that,
Yeah.
you said he's the promise, but yet you want his life. And so how easy would it have been for him to just to justify, well, Lord, you also said don't kill. I shouldn't be doing this.
Yeah.
There's many ways for him
Yeah,
to...
human sacrifice is wicked and
Exactly.
shouldn't be doing that.
Good point.
Sure.
We notice that he was surrounded by pagan nations who had the custom of child sacrifice and how God detested that. So he could have said, well, this fits into that category, therefore I'm not going to do it, Lord.
Yeah.
He could have reasoned, oh, Lord, is this a test? I think you don't want me to really do this, right? He could have justified
Right.
this in his mind many, many, many ways to get out of it.
Yeah.
And the thing that we read here is that's what Satan was trying to do the whole time.
Yeah.
During that 3-day journey, nothing but suggestions whispered in his ear.
Oh, yeah, doubt.
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 Yeah. It's just, that to me is just heavy.
And yet God allowed him to go through that doubt to test him as well.
But one thing I did hear something this week on, I can't take credit for this thought because I didn't come up with it, but it was really beautiful I heard this week, is when you have a conflict between something God has asked you to do,
Yes.
meaning a sacrifice in your own personal life, that this doesn't make sense, the question was raised, what do you do when God doesn't make sense? Because it does happen in this case.
Absolutely.
For example, what do you do when God doesn't make sense? And it's an easy answer, one we overlook really quickly.
Yes.
You have to rely on the promises of God.
Yeah.
And on page
All-
85, and on page 85
Yeah.
towards the bottom, if you wanted to read that, it just said that
Go ahead.
the first time when Satan was at hand to suggest that
Yes.
he must be deceived, like, you must be deceived, this isn't right,
Yeah.
you know, why would God ask you
It's
something
against
like
his
that?
law, yeah.
It said, going outside his tent, Abraham looked up.
Yeah.
First thing he did is looked up to the calm brightness of the unclouded heavens and recalled the promise made nearly 50 years before that his seed should be as numerable as the stars.
The promise
So-
was through Isaac. That it
Yes.
would come through Isaac. So when he had this test, he had to rely on that promise. God, you said it would come through Isaac.
Yeah,
That's all he had to
He
stand
had
on.
two things to go on. First of all, he had been promised that Isaac was going to be the future.
Right.
Yes.
But God had also said that he had to sacrifice Isaac, and he knew both of those had come from God.
Yes.
Right. So he had to decide, okay, I'm going to do what God says, and I'm going to leave the rest to him.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
I-
That had to have been
I mean, the struggle was real.
Unimaginably.
Yeah.
Yeah.
hard.
Absolutely.
But he had to just go back to the simple stuff of what did God say?
You know-
He said, he's told me both of these things, so I'm going to have to rely on both of them.
And so he starts rationalizing, right? He's like, how do these two mesh together?
Right.
And then he starts rationalizing, okay, if God is asking me to take his life, then he must be going to resurrect him.
Yeah.
Right. And one thing I want to point out is that this podcast I was listening to is there. Keep in mind there had been no resurrection to
Right.
this point. The concept of a resurrection is just a thought, right? A
Yes.
theory. It hasn't been performed yet. So
Right.
that's what Abraham had to rely. Okay, if I slay him, God must bring him back to life somehow.
Right.
Right.
You know, something that we don't really talk about much is Isaac.
Mm-hmm.
You know, we focus so much on Abraham, but Isaac
Yeah.
was a willing sacrifice
was.
when he
Yeah.
found out.
Yeah.
You
Because
know,
we don't read about a struggle there to
No.
put him on that altar, do we?
You know, he could have run down that hill and left the old man in the dirt.
He
Yes.
could have.
And,
Yeah.
you know,
But-
easy.
Yeah.
Yes, he could have.
But like you were talking about before, his character of being raised, the way he was raised, and seeing the absolute faith and obedience that his father had was instilled in him. So when he was called, he thought, I loved how we read it, and maybe it was on the podcast that we were listening to, that it got to the point that he thought it was an honor
Yeah.
to make that sacrifice.
You're
You know, most of
right.
the times we think, oh, why didn't he struggle? Why didn't he just run away? No, he stood there and he's like, if God is asking me to do this, it is an honor. Because to be a sacrifice meant you had to be without fault and without blemish.
And
And, he's
again-
like, wow,
Yeah,
he
very-
sees me like that?
Yeah.
Very good point. And it goes back to, you know, Isaac had grown up doing sacrifices with his father.
Exactly.
Doing a sacrifice at the altar was not a foreign concept or image to Isaac. You know, he'd grown up performing this act with him. So like you said,
So it was natural for him to be like, Father, the wood and the fire, but where's the sacrifice?
right. right.
Exactly.
It's like, yeah, exactly. Exactly. But yeah, very good point, Mark. He was willing in this
Yeah.
situation. And like Callie said, he even found himself honored to be.
It was a privilege in his
he-
mind.
Yeah.
Right. That's why immediately he was like, go, you know, it doesn't talk about their conversation after that. He was just like, okay, okay.
Yeah.
And how many times in our lives when we are called to sacrifice, I kick and scream about it.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Kick and scream.
Absolutely.
This can't be what you want.
Right.
You know, and the
Because it's
symbolism,
an inconvenience.
you know, because we're going to have to move on to the next chapter because
Yeah.
it's epic. But before we move on, I just wanted to think about the symbolism as well. Abraham took 2 servants with him to go up.
Was it 2 or 3?
2.
2, okay.
He took 2 people to go with his son to go up on a mountain to be a sacrifice. You see how this is like God, everything's so beautifully, and the Father is the one that actually has to perform that sacrifice. I mean, everything is so, Jesus is so rich in everything that we read. Like, when I was reading that, I was like, he didn't need 2 servants to come with. He could have 5, 10, 20. He chose 2 servants to go with him to go up to that mountain. And not only that, but you go, Lord, what mountain is it that you want me to go to? And it talked about that a cloud
Of glory.
of glory
That's what I was going to point out.
showed
Yeah.
where he was going.
Yeah. Because did he tell him which mounts yet?
No, he just said go.
You'll know it when you see
Right.
it.
There was a cloud of glory up on it.
Yeah.
Such
It
faith.
was just like when he left Ur. It's like,
Yeah.
you'll know it when you get there.
Yeah.
And the only thing that before we moved on to was just the fact that it talked about that on page 87 at the very top, little second part, it said, "Yet none but God could understand how great was the Father's sacrifice in yielding up his son to death. Abraham desired that none but God should witness the parting scene." And I thought about the darkness at the cross.
Yeah.
This is between me and my son, nobody else.
And it did say one thing before, I know we want to go to the next chapter.
We have to go? I'm so
One
sorry.
thing from that podcast that I also drew away that was really beautiful is it does say prior chapters that we know God and Abraham were friends. They were
Absolutely.
good friends. And maybe he did this test because he wanted him to show, I will one day have to sacrifice my son, and I want you to get a sense of what it's going to be like for me as a father to give up my son. I just thought that was very beautiful too.
Yeah.
Only a friend would allow you into such deep
Insight.
emotional insight. But the destruction of Sodom, y'all. Shad, say something.
Where are we at? Chapter 14?
We're
Oh,
chapter
destruction of
14,
Sodom.
which is Genesis 19.
It says here, the fairest among the cities of the Jordan Valley.
Yeah, it talks about it like it was practically the Garden of Eden.
That's what it
Yeah.
did.
That was-
Life was easy.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It was beautiful.
Lush, beautiful. And then you go there
Luxury,
now, and
pride.
it's nothing but desolate, barren land. Nothing, not even a tumbleweed.
Scorched the
Yeah.
earth.
Yeah.
Literally.
Yeah.
Literally.
Yeah. But to imagine something as lush just being so desolate.
Yeah.
And it talked about at the very start, like what the problem was. The very, very start was pride, fullness of bread, abundance of idleness. Neither did she strengthen the hand of the poor and needy, and they were haughty and committed abomination before me. That's quite a list of
Yeah.
Yeah.
issues that they were having.
I think now this is something we can take away from this. How does this apply to us in 2021? Well, we humans have a tendency, when things are going really good, we think, it's because of something we've done. We're so good, right? We're awesome.
Oh, yeah.
And we turn our backs to God, right?
Yeah.
Oh yeah, we don't seek him in the good.
Yeah, right.
Right? All of a sudden we have a moment when it's bad.
Right. When do people flock to churches? When something bad happened in the nation?
Yeah.
Right.
The abundance of idleness. You
Yeah.
know, that
Yeah,
old
the
saying
same-
that,
Same sins that were going on back then are going on right now.
Absolutely.
idle hands are the devil's workshop,
Yeah.
Yeah.
This is proof of it.
For sure. And here it talked about there's nothing more desired among men, just talking about even in our day, than riches and leisure. And yet these gave birth to the sins that brought destruction upon the cities of the plain.
Yeah.
That is such true. If you talk to kids in grade schools or whatever, like, what do you want to be when you grow up? I don't know, but I want to be rich and famous. That's
Yeah.
usually the response,
He
right?
who has the most toys wins.
Exactly. So it's just a continuation of that desire that
Yeah.
these people had.
Yeah. It just goes on, just kind of painting the picture of the situation of Sodom, just pleasure-seeking all the time. But yet it does say that God, they hadn't yet filled their cup of iniquity. God, we got to remember, God is still long-suffering.
Absolutely.
With the nations, with humanity. But there is a limit, right?
Yeah.
There is.
And they knew that they were on the wrong path.
Oh, yeah.
Right, it's one thing to be ignorant.
Yeah.
Kind of wink at ignorance, but
Yeah, they
you're right.
openly defied God.
Yeah.
And had multiple opportunities to come to that truth.
Mm-hmm.
I thought about at the very bottom of 91 on the left side, it said, while angels drew on their mission of destruction, men were dreaming of prosperity and pleasure. And it said the last day was like every other that had come and gone. Evening fell upon a scene of loveliness and security. And I really thought of Matthew 24 when,
Peace and safety.
yes, that they were eating, drinking, giving in marriage and all those things. No thought that this actually is the last day that they were going to have.
Yeah, that kind of just was really profound with me, is to go on living about their lives not knowing that was it for them. But they don't even know it. But then I thought about in the future how the same will be when close of probation comes. We don't know when close of probation happens on the earth or on individual lives. Right? It's just like something significant is happening and we're not even aware.
Very
Oh,
true.
yeah.
Every day is an opportunity. Don't let a day go by kind of warning.
Yeah. That's why you have to be converted every day,
Yes.
Yeah.
not put it off.
Yeah, because it goes on to talk about, because the character also in this story is Lot,
You're right.
and it talked about how he was courteous and hospitable. Lot was.
Yeah. Well, he'd been around Abraham.
Exactly.
It talked about how Abraham, when he rescued Lot and took him back, and He didn't want any reward. He didn't want, and it was just unbelievable to the Sodomites that he wouldn't want wealth and fame, and it was just such a foreign concept to them.
Yeah.
That's
In
a
other
good
words,
point.
Here's a man who's doing right just because it's right and not for anything that's,
Yeah,
he's
not
not
for
in
the
it for
reward.
himself.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You're right. With the character of that city, it would have been gawking. Like, what do you mean you don't want anything?
It's like leaving money on the table. You're not going to
Yeah.
take it?
Yeah.
Well, give it to me.
But then it talks about these two strangers that drew near to the city
Yeah.
gate.
That's right.
These two strangers were. Little do they know how important those two strangers were, how they were coming for judgment upon
Yeah,
sin.
scary.
Yeah. And how quickly we see the degradation of Sodom, how quickly the people wanted to do harm to these two strangers.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, if it wasn't for Lot seeing them, walking into the city, saying, "Okay, these people need my help, they're foreigners, let me help them, let me be courteous, hospitable to them." Otherwise, if they were left to the control of the crowd and the rest of the city, what would they have done to these two strangers, right?
I think Lot knew, and that's why
Right.
he was like very urgent about it. He did not let them go.
Well, it brings out that these two angels kind of provoked the crisis.
Yeah.
They dilly-dallied in the street and argued
Yeah.
with him, and
right.
got everybody's attention. It was like,
Yeah.
well, who are these guys?
Right.
Got them curious.
And then he really had an urge, "No, come with me."
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
No, you got to come with me now.
Right. Let me house you for
We've got to
tonight.
get in before the zombies come out.
Yeah.
It's like,
Yeah.
And you think to yourself, Lot, what are you doing out there? If this is pretty dangerous, right?
yeah.
So, and unfortunately, it talked about as well that, on page 92, it was kind of sad to the fact that they had double blindness. Their heart was so hardened that being given up to the hardest of the heart, the stroke of God, when they went blind, it didn't even affect them.
Yeah, they kept doing what they were doing.
Yeah, because normally if God struck a judgment of blindness, you would be like, you would come back, like, God, what's happening? I'm sorry, help me, save me, heal me. Nothing came out of their mouths of that sort. If anything, they were very angry and they were even more enraged.
Oh, the crowd? Yeah.
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But, since we have to kind of go on almost to the next chapter,
Yeah.
but it talked about Lot's delay,
Yeah.
Yes.
the consequences of the delay.
Yeah, he had this thought, all these years I've worked for this stuff, and I'm asked just to leave it all behind. That's kind of was part of that delay.
Yeah, to
Yeah.
leave his wealth.
Right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
To leave everything, his livelihood.
Yeah.
And his wife didn't help much matters either.
No.
Well, his children too.
Yeah, or
he
his
tried to go seek
children.
his two adult children that were
Yeah.
out of the household, and they're like, "We're good."
You're crazy.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, that's basically what they were like.
Yeah.
We have everything we need here.
Yeah. But it brought out, if he had just grabbed everybody as soon as they told him to get out and left, his wife would have been okay, his daughters would have been okay, but he ended up living in a cave.
And the rest of the story is
Yeah,
Yeah.
rough.
Yeah.
Oh,
it is.
yeah.
Yeah.
But yeah, that delay, I mean, when there's time of delay, that we can that's where we get in trouble. We can rationalize and tell ourselves certain things that we can believe our own lies, is what I'm getting at.
It also brought up the fact of like the whole conversation that Abraham and Jesus is currently having while these two are down there. And he's like, the whole down from 50 to 10 people. And it talked
Yeah.
about how it was in an answer to the patriarch's prayer, the one man who feared God was snatched from destruction. Power of prayer.
Intercession prayer.
Yeah.
It's also interesting too that they were told to go to the mountain, but then Lot said to try to change their mind. Well, no, let's not. Let's go to this other city over here.
It's a small one. It's
a
not a big
small
deal. Even though it's
one.
wicked too,
Yeah, it's just not as wicked as the others.
Right. Yeah, that was a really interesting negotiating.
Yeah.
Like escape for your life, but can I go over to the small city over here? Like,
Yeah.
I think it goes back to those cartoons we used to watching as children. Is the fire came down on the whole plain.
Yeah.
We think it's just literally on this little city and this little city here, but it's really on the whole plain.
Yeah.
That's why they had to escape to the mountains, or they were
Yeah.
instructed to escape
right.
to the mountains.
And we always, I never knew that Zoar later received judgment as well.
Right. I mean, yeah.
Apparently they didn't get the hint
Yeah, no,
When the
it is.
fire,
when they were
fire.
surrounded by flaming destruction.
Yeah.
They kept on their evil ways.
Right,
And Lot realized, yeah, I got to get out of town.
Yeah.
It's not going to work here.
You know, what grave consequences for choosing a path that you know in your heart. He lived there long enough, he knew this is not a good place. And yet he stayed there, you know.
Right.
It just shows the consequences of living or putting things in your life that are not uplifting God, and the results of that, not only for you, but the people around you.
Yeah. And it goes related to that. It says, you know, they were sliding the offers of mercy from God. You know, you're right. Lot should have known better. You know, as things were progressing and degrading as a city, he should have said, yeah, this is not where I need to be or where my family needs to be. But he got comfortable there.
Ooh. And before we move on to the marriage of Isaac and Rebecca, what it's talked about on page 95, it said the Redeemer of the world, because, you know, we have to bring it back to our time. You know, we always like throw that back there, but actually they're there, those stories are there for us. So the Redeemer of the world declares that there are greater sins than that for which Sodom and Gomorrah were destroyed.
Right.
Those who hear the gospel invitation calling sinners to repentance and heed it not are more guilty before God than were the dwellers in the vale of Siddim.
Yeah.
Well, that's what Jesus told the people in his day, that it was going to be a lot better off for Sodom and Gomorrah in
Yeah.
the judgment than them, because they knew better for sure.
Yeah.
Because he had come in the flesh.
In the flesh.
Yeah.
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 And I think another point.
You're
related
right. I forgot about that verse, but it's so
Yeah.
came to life when you said it.
One thing that struck a chord with me was this line. It says, just as in those days of Noah and in Lot, there must be a marked separation from sin and sinners. We like to put ourselves like just right there, joined at the hip with all these things. But
Yeah.
I mean, especially if we believe that that Christ is coming, then it's almost like time to let go of this stuff, right?
Yeah.
Absolutely.
How close can we get to the world but not cross the line and be in the world?
Wasn't
You know,
that
it's like,
isn't that Satan's favorite game?
yeah.
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 And yet there was even greater, right? Because just below it says, and still greater sin is theirs who profess to know God and to keep his commandments, and yet who deny Christ and their character in their daily life. So even greater than that before is definitely a warning for us.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And how about this, you know, really quickly? So they came out a lot. It's like, what's that saying? You take the girl out of the city, but you can't take the city out of the girl. It kind of reminded me of his.
Is that how you feel? I'm just kidding.
But that kind of reminds me of his daughters, right? And
Yeah.
Oh,
he brought them
wow.
out, and
Yeah.
we don't need to go into the horrible details of that situation, but what came of that was, you know, two enemies of the nation of Israel, which was the Moabites and the Ammonites, were a result of this situation.
That's a really good object, or like, what is it, a phrase?
Analogy?
To put with them.
Yeah.
Because, you could not take away Sodom from their characters.
Right.
Because what they did was not good. Yeah. They rose up two nations that were a thorn and a terrible hindrance for the nation of Israel.
And their logic was sound, though. They thought the whole world was destroyed, but, you know,
Again, let us do what we can to help God.
yeah,
right?
we got to.
But here's the thing, their logic was like, I'm in a mountain, I can look behind me and there's a whole bunch of like road behind us, or whatever. I'm only seeing the plain before me as a lake of fire and up in smoke. Couldn't there be more world in the mountain?
Right.
Yeah.
But you're right, their logic was, where there's nobody left. It's only our Father. The logic shows how corrupted they were,
Yes.
because they wouldn't even uphold what was knowingly right in that moment. They took everything in their hands, just like their father did just a little bit ago with Zoar, taking it in his own hands.
Yeah.
It kind of reminds me when people in this time period, when they're choosing a home, they don't think of choosing a place that has good morals and
Right.
good religion, but they choose a place that looks beautiful, like Las Vegas, California,
For the
lots of-
perks, right?
For the
Lots
perks.
of stuff to do.
Yeah.
We should probably go on to the last chapter. We're running short on time.
Oh, yes.
But we,
minutes.
Spend all day on that.
let's cover chapter 15 real quick. It's about some.
This is such a sweet change from
Yes.
talking about Sodom and Gomorrah.
Yes.
Yes, it was.
Yeah.
And nobody wants to begin?
I think we'll just leave it at that.
Yeah.
It was. All right.
It's,
No.
it's about the marriage of Isaac and the leading up to that and how that unfolds.
And here we had just a chapter of like the consequences of parenting with these daughters we see in this, and now we're going to see the parenting on another side.
That's right.
God's way, yeah.
Yeah.
One thing that came out is, very first, this chapter comes out and says that God had forbidden intermarriage between his people and the I guess the heathen nations, right?
The unbelievers.
The unbelievers,
Yeah.
because point was to protect the lineage of the knowledge of God, not for it not to be perverted or disregarded.
Yeah.
So God did, he set, a standard for marriage at this point. He didn't want to intermarry believers and unbelievers
For
to
sure.
protect against apostasy.
Yeah.
And I like the fact that Isaac trusted his father enough to have
Yeah.
him select his wife for him instead of going and taking somebody that he lustily liked or something
Sure.
like that.
Sure.
But that's twofold, right? We view that from Isaac's point of view. Like, that also means Abraham must have been a great dad.
Yeah,
To
exactly.
where he said, I trust you, Dad. I trust you, Pops, old man, whatever he called him.
And he trusted his servant to go pick the wife for him
Yeah.
instead of Abraham picking herself.
Can you imagine being Eleazar?
Yeah.
No pressure here, right?
Yeah,
I got to
no
get
kidding.
You're
a
only-
wife for my...
Yeah. You're only my top servant, and I trust you. The future of my nation, of our
Yeah,
family.
the future of the world is in your hands.
Yeah.
Don't
Don't screw it up.
No pressure.
But then what's funny, not to get too ahead, is I would think, like, if I've never heard the story, how's it unfold? He goes through a lineage of girls to see, he sifts through buckets and buckets of women to find the right one.
No.
He really doesn't sift through that many
No.
women at all.
No.
It's
No.
kind of like, Lord just really leads him
Yeah.
to Rebecca.
You know, Abraham had a simple faith, Isaac had a simple
So did
faith, and
Eliezer.
Eleazar had a simple
Yes.
faith.
Yeah.
As a matter of fact, when he's approaching this the area, he
Yeah.
already prays, Lord, guide my steps.
Because Eliezer was his son. Before he had a son,
Adopted
he was
son.
his adopted
That's
son.
right.
So he raised him and had a relationship like he was his
Yeah,
son.
Right. Good point, Kelly.
Yeah. And he had been the longest, that's why he said the one that's been the longest with me.
It's also, we forget, it was Abraham's household who worshiped God at these altars.
Yes.
So Eliezer is aware of these.
Oh,
the knowledge of
absolutely.
God.
And he had hundreds of servants and people
Yeah.
with him. It's interesting that there weren't any girls locally that he would
Right.
trust
Yeah.
Yeah.
to have, to be his daughter-in-law.
Right.
He had to send off for a mail order bride.
That's right, man. Older
Must have
bride.
been just a shortage of females out in the.
Maybe so.
But there wasn't, like Mark
Yeah.
said. So there has to be more to the story than just, there wasn't any women in our encampments.
Yeah. Yeah.
Any godly women.
Exactly. So there's more to that story.
Yeah.
And then also, you got to give credit to Rebecca. I mean, then their family's like, well, ask the maiden, will she go? So it's,
Yeah.
I will go. Simple as that.
I know. I mean, all these
wanna
people are
sleep on
just
it?
simple-minded.
Yeah.
Whatever God says to do, they're doing it.
And here we had Lot just before negotiating his
Yeah.
way. People are just like, okay.
Yeah.
I would have considered it totally understandable if she wanted to sleep on it. But no, she's like, yeah, I'll go.
Yeah. Yeah, I met this guy today at the well, and now I'm leaving with him.
Tell me about a young man that wants marriage, so sure.
Sure.
I'll go.
To a place I've never been,
Yeah.
to a person I never
People I
met.
don't even know.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yes.
Yeah, Eliezer wouldn't even eat
Right.
until he spilled the beans.
Yeah, you're right. He's like, they wanted to be hospitable. He's like, wait, hold the phone before you even serve me. Here's what I'm here for.
Yeah.
Here's my business.
I'm on a mission.
Yeah,
I'm on a mission.
I'm on a mission for
And I'm
God.
a wishing.
Yeah.
I'm wishing you can cure this condition.
Yeah, before you bust out the lemonade, let's just get this out of the way.
That's right.
And of course, Isaac is now how old? He's 40 when this is
Yeah.
happening.
Yeah.
So he's not young by no means. He's now 40 years old, which is probably the age we all should get married. But
One thing really quickly I did find interesting is sounds like in that time it was custom for the parents to arrange.
yes.
Now I did see, correct me if I'm wrong, and I might be stretching here, doing a lot of assumption, but it sounds like in these situations, you didn't have to take the first offer your parents
Yeah,
presented to you.
exactly.
Right.
Sounds like if it wasn't, you were never going to be forced to marry somebody you felt you could never love.
Right,
long-term.
and that's why they were like, well, let's see what Rebecca says.
Right.
Because
Yeah.
she had a choice too.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, everybody thinks that the women had no
Right.
rights, no say or anything, but that wasn't true.
Right. I think in the heathen nations that probably was true, but in the God-fearing nations it probably wasn't. You
Yeah.
know what I mean? Because I think everybody had, in the general consensus of the world at this time, had arranged marriages. But when it came to to Abraham's lineage, you have a choice. There was a respect for the women in this relation,
Right.
Yeah. One
which
thing
is such a beautiful picture of how God treats us, right?
Yeah.
You still have choice.
One thing I want to point out real quickly as we're out of time is we always focus on Abraham, Isaac, but let's also give credit to Isaac and Sarah, that relationship, because it says, like when she passed away, Rebecca was there to comfort him. He must have had a great relationship with his mother as well.
Oh,
I mean, I think
yeah.
it takes two to bring up a child's character. It wasn't all credit to Abraham.
Yeah.
I think it's Sarah and Abraham.
Oh,
yeah. So we just quickly glance over the mother-son relationship in this story.
Right, because no other woman had filled that void. So
Right.
when he
All the way up to age
all the
40.
way up,
To age
because
40.
we don't know when. I'm not sure. I'd have to go back and see when she passed.
Right.
What age
Yeah.
he was.
At least up to age 40.
And so, so here he is 40, but he's still grieving his mom.
Yeah.
Because it talked about Rebecca comforted him in that missing place that he had for a woman in his
Right.
life.
Right.
So that was a good point, to not gloss over her effects on her son.
Point is, you moms out there, we see you. We're not going to glance over you. We're aware of the effort you guys
Yeah.
put in.
Now, I like too, and it says on page 103, it says, if there is any subject which should be carefully considered and in which the counsel of older and more experienced persons should be sought, it is the subject of marriage.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yes, it's...
What is it we talked about before? Like, it's your greatest joy or your greatest sorrow.
Yeah.
Make sure you choose right.
and
That's
we
right.
treat it so
Flippant.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly.
Like very trivial. It's like, oh yeah, I mean,
They
I
even
made a
have drive-through
decision.
marriages in these times.
Yeah.
That's
Instead of
true.
realizing, like Kenneth said, this is the greatest decision they're making. It's either for joy or for sorrows. So,
Yeah, and who knows that better? Abraham.
Yeah.
That's right.
yeah, that's true.
Well, we only have a few more minutes if you guys want to have closing thoughts.
Closing thoughts. It's good stuff. That's all I can say.
Yeah.
Yes.
Just a lot of themes to contemplate, throughout all these stories especially here in these first beginnings of the Bible. Just so many great themes being set out before us. But the common theme is God's mercy towards us. Humanity fell. We created the hot mess express, but yet He's still merciful to us and is with us.
Yeah. Shattermark?
The thing that sticks out to me is how simple faith is. These days we want to make religion complicated, but it's not.
Sure.
It needs to be kept simple. And all these heroes of the Bible kept it simple.
They really did.
The KISS principle, keep
Yeah.
it simple, stupid.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So,
They really did. Like, that's a very good point. Very good point.
It's very serious business. I mean, it's not something to be taken lightly.
Yeah.
I mean, it has drastic effects.
If I can add to Mark, I think it's a very good point. They kept it so simple that they could act upon it. Sometimes we make it so complicated we can't act upon it.
Yeah.
I apologize. I always go back to sports analogies. And I apologize. But like a coach, if you make the playbook too complicated, your team won't be able to perform.
Yeah.
They won't be able to execute it.
Yeah.
But if you keep it simple, they can execute on
And
it.
that's why how old of a child can understand this Bible?
There you go.
It doesn't matter. I mean, you can have children so little, and they know it better than an adult.
That's true.
That's because God has made His Word so simple that anybody could come to it and know Him.
yeah.
And so, on that note, Mike,
Well, how about Mark? Would you like to close that with prayer? We thank you
Sure.
for joining us
Yes.
for another week of Walk Through the Ages. We hope you're enjoying it as much as we are, obviously.
Yeah.
So we thank you for bearing with us. Again, emphasis on that this is unedited and unscripted.
absolutely.
And if
Very
you have any
much.
comments,
Yes,
don't
please
forget
add
to comment.
comments. Absolutely, Chad, good point. Please send us your comments. So with that being said, go ahead and
All right.
Yeah.
Father in heaven, we're thankful for this study that we've had, and we're just so thankful for the insights that we can gain from these books and from your word, and we just pray that everyone who reads it will find you, and we pray it in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen.
Until next time.